Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Take a deep breath, get cozy, and let the tranquility of the moment guide you into rest. The RV hummed steadily as it cruised down the highway, the sound a comforting backdrop to the otherwise silent road. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the dense line of trees flanking either side of the asphalt. Inside the RV, Ryan leaned back in the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel and the other fiddling with the radio dial. Static hissed through the speakers. "Don't bother," Emily said, glancing up from the map spread across her lap. "We're too far out for any stations." Ryan grinned. "Guess we'll have to make our own entertainment. How about a sing-along? You start." Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "Pass. I'd rather navigate." "Suit yourself," Ryan replied, settling on a crackling oldies station that barely came through. He tapped the wheel in time with the faint rhythm, his carefree demeanor a stark contrast to Emily's furrowed brow as she traced their route. "You sure this road's the right one?" she asked, her tone more serious now. "It doesn't look like the highway on the map." Ryan glanced over, his smile unwavering. "Babe, it's the only road for miles. We're fine. What's the worst that could happen? We end up somewhere cool and unexplored." Emily sighed, folding the map. "That's what I'm afraid of." The road stretched endlessly ahead, perfectly straight, with no signs, no intersections, and no other cars. It was as if they were the only people in the world. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees seemed unnaturally dense, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that dimmed the light. "Do you think we'll hit a town soon?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. "We should have seen a gas station by now." Ryan glanced at the gas gauge, which read just over half full. "We've got plenty to keep going. Relax, Em. It's an adventure." Emily didn't respond. She leaned her head against the window, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of life. The monotonous scenery was disorienting, the lack of variation making it hard to tell how far they'd gone. They passed a rusted sign leaning precariously against a tree. The words were barely legible, faded and worn by time, but Emily caught the phrase "turn back" just before they sped past. "Did you see that?" she asked, sitting up straighter. "See what?" Ryan replied, glancing in the rearview mirror. "The sign. It said, 'Turn back.'" Ryan chuckled. "Probably some prank. You know how these back roads are. Teenagers messing around." Emily frowned. It didn't look like a prank. It looked old, like it's been there forever. "Even more reason not to worry," Ryan said lightly. "It's probably been there since the 70s. We'll be fine." But Emily couldn't shake the chill that had crept up her spine. She turned to look out the rear window, but the sign was already out of sight, swallowed by the endless road. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows stretched longer, painting the road in dark streaks. The faint sound of static crackled through the radio, growing louder as the signal faltered. Ryan fiddled with the dial again, but every station was the same, white noise and faint, distorted voices just out of range. "Maybe we should stop for the night," Emily suggested, her unease growing. "Find a safe spot to park." Ryan gestured at the empty road around them. "There's nowhere to stop, Em. No rest areas, no pull-offs. We're better off driving until we hit something." Emily's eyes darted to the gas gauge, which now hovered closer to a quarter tank. "We don't have much farther we can go." As if in response, the RV shuddered slightly, and the dashboard lights flickered. Ryan frowned, tapping the gas gauge. "That's weird. I'm sure we had more than that." Emily's heart raced. "What do you mean? How much do we have left?" "Enough," Ryan said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Let's keep going." They drove on, the road stretching endlessly into the horizon. The dense trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the remaining light. Emily checked her phone for the 100th time, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. Suddenly, she sat up straighter. "Ryan, slow down." "What is it?" he asked, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "There's someone there." Ryan squinted, his hands tightening on the wheel. A figure stood at the edge of the road, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but the way it stood, motionless and facing them, sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Should we stop?" Ryan asked, though his tone suggested he didn't want to. "No," Emily said quickly. "Just keep going." As they passed the figure, Emily turned her head to get a better look. It was a man, dressed in dark, tattered clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. But his eyes, or where his eyes should have been, glowed faintly like embers in the darkness. "Did you see his eyes?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Ryan didn't answer. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, and the RV picked up speed. Minutes later, they passed a dead tree with twisted branches. Emily stared at it, a sense of déjà vu washing over her. "We've seen that tree before," she said. Ryan shook his head. "Impossible. It's just a tree." "No, it's the same tree," Emily insisted. "And that sign, look." Another rusted sign leaned against a tree, identical to the one they'd seen earlier. "Turn back." Ryan's grip tightened on the wheel. "We didn't miss any turns, did we?" "There haven't been any turns," Emily said, her voice rising. "Ryan, I think we're driving in circles." He glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "That's not possible. The road is straight." But as they drove on, the landmarks began to repeat. The dead tree, the rusted sign, and then the figure. Only this time, it was closer to the road. The RV's engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights flickered again. The gas gauge dipped lower, almost empty now. Ryan cursed under his breath, his usual calm unraveling. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice taut. "This doesn't make any sense." Emily's hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. "We need to stop. Whatever this is, we can't just keep driving." Ryan nodded reluctantly, pulling the RV to the side of the road. The headlights illuminated the endless stretch of asphalt ahead, but the forest beyond remained impenetrably dark. They sat in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Emily glanced at Ryan, his face pale and drawn. "What do we do now?" she asked. Before he could answer, the radio crackled to life. A distorted voice cut through the static, low and malevolent. "Keep driving." The RV glided along the empty road, its tires humming against the asphalt. The late afternoon sun filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting shifting shadows that danced like ghosts on the windshield. Inside, Ryan hummed softly, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel, while Emily studied the map spread across her lap. "This road isn't marked," Emily muttered, frowning. "It's not on the map, and the GPS keeps glitching." Ryan glanced at the screen mounted on the dashboard. The GPS flickered, the route recalculating endlessly before freezing entirely. "Probably a dead zone," he said lightly. "We're in the middle of nowhere." "It's normal." "Normal," Emily repeated, her tone skeptical. She stared out the window, her eyes following the monotonous line of trees. They seemed too dense, their branches weaving together to form an impenetrable wall. "It doesn't feel normal." Ryan chuckled, trying to diffuse her tension. "Relax, Em. It's just a road trip. You're overthinking it." But Emily couldn't shake the unease building in her chest. Something about the road felt wrong, as though they had entered a place that wasn't meant to be traveled. They passed an old, weathered sign propped against a tree. The paint was peeling, but the words were still legible. "Turn back." Emily straightened in her seat. "Ryan, did you see that?" "See what?" "That sign. It said, 'Turn back.'" Ryan shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's probably a joke. Someone's idea of roadside art." "It didn't look like a joke," Emily said, her voice tightening. "It looked like a warning." Ryan waved off her concern. "We've got gas, food, and each other. What could go wrong?" Emily didn't answer. She leaned against the window, watching as the road stretched endlessly ahead. The silence in the RV grew heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from the radio. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the road. Emily glanced at the dashboard and frowned. The gas gauge, which had been steady at half full, now hovered just above a quarter. "We're losing fuel faster than we should," she said, her voice edged with panic. Ryan tapped the gauge with his finger. "It's probably just the sensor. These things aren't always accurate." Emily's unease deepened. "What if it's not? What if we run out before we find a station?" "We won't," Ryan said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. They passed a twisted tree with gnarled branches, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Emily stared at it, her pulse quickening. Minutes later, they passed the same tree again. "Ryan," she said sharply, "we've seen that tree before." Ryan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "That's impossible. The road is straight. We haven't turned." "Exactly," Emily said. "So why are we looping back?" Ryan's jaw tightened, and he pressed his foot harder on the gas. "It's probably just a similar-looking tree. Don't overthink it." But as the landmarks began to repeat, the rusted sign, the twisted tree, Emily's unease turned to dread. "We're going in circles," she whispered. The radio, which had been silent for hours, crackled to life. A faint, distorted voice whispered through the static, "Keep driving." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I heard it." "What did it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ryan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, where the darkness seemed to gather and thicken, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The first figure appeared on the side of the road as twilight descended. Emily spotted it first, a shadowy silhouette standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. "Ryan, slow down," she said, her voice urgent. "There's someone there." Ryan eased off the gas, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure. It didn't move. It stood perfectly still, facing the road as though waiting for them to approach. "Should we stop?" Ryan asked, though the hesitation in his voice suggested he didn't want to. "No," Emily said quickly. "Just keep driving." As they passed, the figure remained motionless, its face obscured by shadows. But Emily could have sworn she saw its head turn to follow their movement. They passed the same figure again minutes later, only this time it was closer to the road. Emily's heart pounded as she gripped the edge of her seat. "Ryan, what's happening?" "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. "But I'm not stopping to find out." The RV picked up speed, its engine roaring as they barreled down the endless stretch of road. The headlights illuminated the trees, their branches seeming to claw at the vehicle as they sped past. Emily glanced at the gas gauge. It was nearly empty. "We're running out of fuel," she said, panic rising in her throat. "Then we'll have to stop," Ryan said reluctantly. But only for a minute. They pulled to the side of the road, the RV shuddering to a halt. The darkness outside was absolute, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Ryan killed the engine, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Emily reached for her phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. She glanced at Ryan, her fear mirrored in his eyes. "What do we do now?" she whispered. The radio crackled again, louder this time. The same distorted voice broke through, clearer than before. "You can't leave." The headlights flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the trees. In one flash, Emily saw them, figures emerging from the forest, their forms shrouded in shadow. They moved slowly, deliberately, their glowing eyes fixed on the RV. "Ryan," Emily said, her voice shaking. "They're coming." Ryan started the engine, but it sputtered and died. He cursed, turning the key again and again, but the RV refused to start. The figures moved closer, their shapes becoming more defined. Emily could see their twisted faces, their jagged limbs reaching toward the vehicle. "Drive," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm trying." Ryan shouted back, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. The radio crackled one final time, the voice rising above the static. "You shouldn't have come." The road stretched endlessly, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a forest, so dense it seemed to swallow the light. The trees flanking it were impossibly tall, their dark trunks rising like pillars into a canopy of interwoven branches that blocked out the sky. Even in the daylight, the road felt cloaked in shadow, the sunlight reduced to faint beams that flickered like dying embers. As the RV trundled along, the tires hummed on the worn surface, a sound that was both soothing and unsettling. Ryan adjusted his grip on the wheel, glancing occasionally at the GPS, which had long since frozen. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the trees. She couldn't help but notice how they seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to encroach on the road. "There's something weird about this place," she murmured, more to herself than to Ryan. "Just trees, Em," Ryan replied with forced cheer. "Lots of trees." But Emily shook her head. The trees weren't just trees. Their bark was gnarled and cracked, oozing dark sap that glistened like oil. Some of the trunks bore strange markings, scratches or carvings, that didn't look natural. The patterns twisted and spiraled, reminding her of something ancient, something primal. The road itself was unnervingly straight, as though it had been carved with a ruler through the wilderness. There were no signs, no mile markers, no intersections. The monotony of it was disorienting. Emily had tried to track their progress using the map, but every landmark she expected to see had failed to materialize. It was as if the road had rewritten itself, refusing to conform to any charted path. The asphalt was riddled with cracks and potholes, some of which seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, a sharp tang that lingered at the back of her throat. Occasionally, they passed patches of grass or shrubs growing in odd, unnatural patterns, their edges too sharp, their colors too vivid against the muted tones of the forest. The most unsettling feature of the road was its silence. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of civilization. Even the RV's engine seemed quieter than usual, as if the road itself absorbed sound. Emily leaned closer to the window, trying to catch any sign of life, but there was nothing. No birds, no animals, not even an insect buzzing past. Hours passed, or at least that's what it felt like. The road remained unchanged, an unyielding stretch of gray that seemed to mock their efforts to move forward. Emily began to notice subtle shifts in the forest. The trees appeared closer to the road, their branches almost grazing the RV's windows. Shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally across the asphalt, forming shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when she blinked. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ryan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "See what?" "The shadows. They're moving." Ryan shook his head. "It's just your imagination. The light's playing tricks on you." But Emily wasn't convinced. She leaned back in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and tried to focus on the faint rhythm of the tires on the road. It didn't help. The sound was too steady, too hypnotic, lulling her into a state where the line between reality and imagination blurred. As twilight fell, the road took on an even more menacing quality. The trees seemed to close in completely, their branches forming an archway that turned the road into a tunnel of darkness. The RV's headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the cracked asphalt and the occasional streak of something that looked like blood, but was too faint to confirm. The first sign of repetition came as they passed a twisted tree with gnarled branches that jutted out like skeletal arms. Emily stared at it, unease churning in her stomach. A few minutes later, they passed it again. This time, she was certain it was the same tree. "Ryan," she said, her voice tight, "we've been here before." "What are you talking about?" "That tree. It's the same one. We're going in circles." Ryan glanced at the road behind them, then at the GPS, which still refused to cooperate. "We can't be. The road's straight." "Exactly," Emily said. "So why does everything look the same?" The next sign was a rusted metal post leaning precariously against a tree. The paint was peeling, but the faint words, "turn back," were still visible. They passed it once, then again, and again. Each time, the sign seemed to grow more weathered, the letters darker and more ominous. The air inside the RV grew colder, and the faint scent of metal intensified. Emily rubbed her arms, trying to dispel the chill that had settled over her. "This isn't normal," she said. "We need to stop." "Stop where?" Ryan shot back, frustration edging his voice. "There's nothing here. No turnoffs, no rest stops, just this damn road." As if in response, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, followed by a faint, distorted voice. "Keep driving." Emily's blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, I heard it. What do we do?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The road became more surreal as night fell. The asphalt seemed to ripple in the headlights, the cracks and potholes shifting as though alive. The forest pressed closer, the branches scraping against the RV like claws. Emily stared out the window, her reflection pale and ghostly against the dark glass. She thought she saw movement among the trees, figures darting between the trunks, too quick to catch. "Ryan, slow down," she said, her voice shaking. "There's something out there." Ryan glanced at the road ahead, his knuckles white on the wheel. "It's just your imagination." "There's nothing." He stopped mid-sentence as the first figure appeared. It stood at the edge of the road, motionless, its face obscured by shadows. As they passed, Emily thought she saw its head turn to follow them, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Minutes later, they saw the same figure again. Only this time, it was closer to the road. The RV's engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights flickered. The gas gauge, which had been half full hours ago, now hovered dangerously close to empty. Ryan cursed under his breath, his usual calm unraveling. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "None of this makes sense." Emily stared at the road ahead, her heart pounding. The asphalt seemed to stretch infinitely into the distance, but for the first time, she felt as though it was leading them nowhere. The road wasn't just a path, it was a trap, and they were caught in its web. The RV hummed steadily along the desolate road, the headlights piercing through the gathering dusk. The road, perfectly straight and eerily featureless, stretched into infinity, flanked by dense, unyielding forest. Inside, the air grew tense as Emily's unease began to take root. "We've been on this road for hours," she muttered, glancing at the dashboard clock. "It feels like we're not getting anywhere." "Ryan," gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual, forced a casual tone. It's just a long stretch of nothing. We'll hit a town soon. We always do. Emily wasn't convinced. Her eyes flicked to the trees outside the window, their branches intertwining like a cage. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It felt as if the road had swallowed all sound. Then she saw it. A gnarled, twisted tree with jagged branches that clawed at the sky. "That's a creepy-looking tree," she remarked, trying to break the tension. Ryan glanced briefly and shrugged. "Just a tree." But 10 minutes later, they passed it again. Emily sat up straighter, her stomach nodding. "Ryan, that's the same tree." Ryan laughed nervously. "Come on, Em. You really think there's only one weird tree on this whole road?" "I know what I saw," she insisted. "It's the same one. We're going in circles." "That's not possible," Ryan said firmly, though the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed him. "The road hasn't turned once. It's straight as an arrow." Emily stared at him, her chest tightening. "Then explain how we passed the same tree twice." Ryan didn't answer. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, the RV accelerating down the endless stretch of asphalt. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road. Emily tried to shake off the growing unease, but her nerves frayed further when they passed a rusted road sign leaning against a tree. The faded letters read, "Turn back." "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Yeah," Ryan said, gripping the wheel tighter. "Probably a joke. Some local kids messing around." Emily frowned. It didn't look like a joke. It looked old. Before Ryan could respond, the same rusted sign appeared again, this time leaning at a slightly different angle. The words were darker now, more prominent. "Turn back." Emily's pulse quickened. "Okay, now you can't tell me that's a coincidence." Ryan glanced in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. "It's not, but I don't know what's going on." The dashboard clock blinked 7:34 p.m., the same time it had shown for the past hour. Emily tapped the screen of her phone, but it refused to connect to any signal. Frustrated, she turned to Ryan. "The clock's stuck. My phone's useless, and we're passing the same landmarks over and over. This isn't just us getting lost, Ryan. Something's wrong." Ryan didn't reply. He was too focused on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The tension in the RV was palpable, the hum of the engine the only sound cutting through the suffocating silence. As twilight fell, the repetition grew more pronounced. They passed the same gnarled tree for the third time, its twisted branches now etched into Emily's mind. The turn back sign appeared once more, its letters seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. Emily's stomach churned as she realized the forest itself looked closer now, the trees leaning in as if trying to swallow the road. "Ryan, stop the RV," she demanded, her voice trembling. "What? Why?" "Because this isn't normal. We have to stop and figure out what's happening." Ryan hesitated, glancing at the gas gauge. It had been at half full earlier, but now it hovered near empty. "We don't have time to stop," he said. "We're running low on gas. We need to find a station." "There are no stations," Emily snapped. "There's nothing here except this damn road and those creepy signs." The radio crackled suddenly, startling them both. A faint, distorted voice broke through the static. "Keep driving." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What the hell was that?" Ryan shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. Probably interference or something." "Interference from what?" Emily shot back. "There's nothing out here." The radio crackled again, louder this time. The voice was clearer, more insistent. "Don't stop. Keep driving." Ryan reached out and turned the radio off, his hand shaking. But the words lingered in Emily's ears, a sinister echo that refused to fade. The RV's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and the occasional shadow that seemed to dart across the road. Emily pressed her face to the window, her eyes scanning the forest. She thought she saw movement among the trees, figures darting between the trunks, too quick to catch. "Ryan," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I think there's something in the woods." Ryan didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the road ahead, where the darkness seemed to thicken like a living thing. The gnarled tree loomed again, its twisted branches unmistakable. This time, Emily screamed. "Ryan, that's the fourth time. We're stuck. We're trapped." Ryan slammed his hand against the steering wheel. "I know, okay? I know. But what do you want me to do? There's nowhere to turn, nowhere to stop. We're stuck on this road, and I don't know how to get off." The RV's engine sputtered suddenly, and the headlights flickered. The gas gauge dipped lower, the needle brushing against the red E. Ryan cursed under his breath. We're running on fumes. Emily's breathing quickened. What happens if we run out of gas? What then? Ryan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was answer enough. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, its surface growing darker and more cracked with each passing mile. Emily clutched her seat, her eyes darting between the forest and the dashboard. The dashboard clock still read 7:34 p.m., the unchanging numbers mocking her growing fear. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by the flickering headlights. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinct but undeniably human. Emily's stomach turned as they passed it, her eyes locking onto its form. "Ryan," she whispered, "did you see that?" "See what?" he asked, his voice tight. "The person on the side of the road." Ryan glanced in the rearview mirror, his face pale. "There's no one there." Emily twisted in her seat, but the figure was gone. She turned back to Ryan, her voice shaking. "It was there. I know it was." Ryan didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched. "We'll figure this out," he said finally. "We just have to keep going." But Emily wasn't so sure. The road wasn't just leading them in circles. It was alive, and it wasn't letting them go. The tension inside the RV was palpable, the air thick with unspoken fear. The road ahead stretched endlessly, but now even Ryan could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The forest, the asphalt, even the sky seemed heavier, more oppressive, as though the world itself was conspiring against them. "Ryan," Emily said, her voice trembling, "did you notice the gas gauge?" Ryan glanced down, his brow furrowing. "What the hell?" The needle, which had been hovering near half full, now rested just above empty. He tapped the gauge, as if willing it to reset. "This can't be right. We haven't driven far enough to burn that much fuel." Emily's grip on the armrest tightened. "It's not just the gas. Look at the clock." The digital display on the dashboard blinked 7:34 p.m., the same time it had shown for what felt like hours. Ryan shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's broken. It has to be." But Emily wasn't convinced. She turned her phone over in her hands, hoping for a signal. The screen glowed faintly, displaying the same frozen time. No bars. No connection. Just the mocking stillness of the unchanging numbers. The first incident came with a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the RV. It started faintly, like raindrops on the roof, but the sky outside was clear, devoid of any clouds. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan slowed the RV, the hum of the engine dropping to a low growl. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, coming from somewhere beneath them. "Stay here," Ryan said, grabbing the flashlight from the dashboard. He opened the door cautiously, the cool night air rushing in as he stepped outside. The tapping stopped immediately. Emily leaned toward the window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to see what Ryan was doing. He crouched near the RV's undercarriage, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "I don't see anything," he called back. A sudden, loud thud from the roof made Emily jump. "Ryan!" she screamed. He stood quickly, his flashlight scanning the top of the RV. Nothing was there. He climbed back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "There's nothing out there," he said, but his eyes betrayed him. He didn't believe his own words. The incidents became harder to dismiss as the night wore on. The radio, which Ryan had turned off hours ago, crackled back to life on its own. Static filled the cabin, punctuated by faint, indecipherable whispers. Emily leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What is it saying?" Ryan shook his head, his hand reaching for the volume knob. But before he could turn it down, a voice broke through the static, clear and cold. "Turn back." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She looked at Ryan, her voice shaking. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "It's just interference. A stray signal." "That's not interference," Emily said firmly. "It's a warning." The gnarled tree came into view again, its twisted branches unmistakable. This time, Emily didn't even need to say it. Ryan slammed his hand against the steering wheel, his frustration boiling over. "That's the 5th time," he shouted. "We're going in circles, and I can't figure out how to get off this damn road." Emily's eyes darted to the forest, where she thought she saw movement. Shadows shifted between the trees, too fast and too deliberate to be a trick of the light. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I think we're being watched." He followed her gaze, but saw nothing. "It's just your imagination," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Emily knew what she saw. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were something else, something alive. The RV's headlights flickered, plunging the road ahead into darkness before sputtering back to life. Emily's heart raced as she gripped the seat. "What's happening?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Ryan didn't answer. He pressed the accelerator, his focus entirely on the road. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning closer, their branches scraping against the sides of the RV like skeletal fingers. And then, for the first time, they weren't alone. The figure appeared in the headlights, standing motionless in the center of the road. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. Ryan swerved, narrowly avoiding it as the RV veered onto the shoulder. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. Emily twisted in her seat, her eyes scanning the road behind them. The figure was gone. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "But it wasn't human." Ryan tightened his grip on the wheel. "It was just a person," he said, as if saying it out loud would make it true. But deep down he knew better. No person could move like that, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. Minutes later, the same figure appeared again. This time closer to the RV, Emily screamed as it reached out a hand, its fingers brushing against the window. Ryan floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as they sped down the endless road. The figure didn't chase them. It didn't need to. It simply stood there watching, its glowing eyes burning into their minds long after it was out of sight. The final incident came as they passed the twisted tree for the 7th time. The radio crackled back to life, and this time, the voice was louder, more insistent. "You can't leave." The words sent a wave of cold dread through Emily. She turned to Ryan, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's right? What if we can't leave?" Ryan didn't answer. His hands trembled on the wheel, his knuckles white. The gas gauge dipped below empty, the needle quivering as the RV sputtered and slowed. The forest seemed to close in completely now, the branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sky. The headlights flickered one final time before plunging them into darkness. Emily's breathing quickened as she gripped Ryan's arm. "What do we do now?" Before he could respond, the RV shuddered to a halt, the engine dying with a low groan. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the faint sound of tapping on the roof. Emily turned to Ryan, her eyes wide with terror. "We're not alone," she whispered. And for the first time, Ryan didn't try to deny it. The RV crawled along the endless road, its headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The tension inside was unbearable, the silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt. Emily's hands gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles white. Ryan was no longer trying to reassure her. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. The air felt heavier now, each breath thick and labored. Emily rubbed her arms, the chill seeping into her bones despite the RV's heater running at full blast. She glanced at the dashboard clock, which still read 7:34 p.m. It hadn't changed in hours. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Why can't we leave this road?" Ryan didn't respond. He was too focused on the stretch of asphalt ahead, which seemed to ripple and shift under the flickering headlights. The forest on either side of them was impenetrable, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The first sign came as a sound. It started faintly, barely audible over the hum of the engine, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Emily sat up straighter, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his grip on the wheel tightening. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. Faint and distorted, it echoed through the RV, filling the small space with an otherworldly resonance. "Turn around." Emily's blood ran cold. She turned to Ryan, her eyes wide with terror. "It's the same voice. The one from the radio." Ryan swallowed hard. "We're not turning around," he said firmly. "We're getting out of here." The lights inside the RV flickered, plunging them into darkness for a brief, heart-stopping moment. When they came back on, Emily let out a sharp gasp. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It was humanoid but wrong, its proportions twisted and unnatural. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like points. The head tilted unnaturally to the side, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Ryan slammed on the brakes, the RV screeching to a halt just feet from the figure. The creature didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on them. "Ryan," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" Ryan shook his head, his breathing uneven. "I don't know." The creature took a single step forward. The movement was jerky, almost mechanical, as if it was being controlled by unseen strings. Emily's heart raced as she clutched Ryan's arm. "We can't just sit here." Ryan nodded and threw the RV into reverse. The creature's head snapped toward them, and it let out a bone-chilling scream that seemed to reverberate through the entire vehicle. Ryan hit the gas, the RV lurching backward as the creature began to move toward them. The forest came alive around them as they reversed down the road. Shadows darted between the trees, their shapes indistinct but undeniably humanoid. The air inside the RV grew colder, frost forming on the windows despite the heater still running. Emily pressed her hands against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "They're everywhere," she whispered. "They're watching us." Ryan didn't respond. His focus was entirely on keeping the RV on the road, but his hands trembled on the wheel. The creature appeared again, this time on the side of the road. It moved in fits and starts, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it approached. Emily screamed as it reached out a clawed hand, its fingers dragging across the RV's side with a screech that set her teeth on edge. Ryan floored the accelerator, the RV lurching forward. The creature disappeared from view, but the oppressive sense of being watched remained. Emily's breathing was ragged, her chest tight with panic. The road ahead began to change. The asphalt was no longer smooth, it cracked and shifted, forming jagged patterns that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The headlights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the forest was bathed in an eerie red light. Emily grabbed Ryan's arm. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "But we have to keep moving." The RV shuddered violently, the engine sputtering as if it was resisting their progress. The air inside grew heavier, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Emily felt a sharp pain in her chest, as though something was squeezing her heart. "Ryan," she gasped, clutching at her chest. "I can't breathe." Ryan glanced at her, his face pale. "Hold on, Em. Just hold on." The figure appeared again, this time directly in front of the RV. Ryan swerved to avoid it, the tires screeching as the RV veered dangerously close to the edge of the road. The creature's scream echoed through the vehicle, louder and more piercing than before. Emily covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop," she cried. Ryan gritted his teeth, his hands shaking as he tried to steady the RV. The creature was gone again, but the road ahead was different. The trees were closer now, their branches arching over the asphalt like a tunnel. The shadows moved more freely, darting across the road in front of the RV. "We're not going to make it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." Ryan shook his head. "Don't say that. We're getting out of here. We have to." The radio crackled to life once more, the static deafening. The same distorted voice spoke, its tone more urgent. "You cannot leave." Emily's hands flew to her ears, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, burrowing into her mind. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the creature was inside the RV. It stood at the far end of the cabin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Emily screamed as it lunged forward, its claws scraping against the walls. "Get down!" Ryan shouted, grabbing the closest object, a heavy flashlight, and hurling it at the creature. The impact made it stumble, but it didn't stop. It advanced on them, its movements jerky and relentless. Emily grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, holding it out in front of her. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice shaking. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes fixed on her. For a moment, it seemed almost human, its twisted features softening. But then it let out another ear-piercing scream and lunged again. Ryan slammed his hand on the dashboard, the RV roaring to life. He threw it into gear, the sudden movement throwing the creature off balance. It tumbled backward, its claws scraping against the floor as it tried to regain its footing. The RV sped down the road, the creature disappearing into the darkness behind them. Emily collapsed into her seat, her hands trembling as she dropped the knife. "Is it gone?" she whispered. Ryan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, where the shadows continued to move. The road wasn't letting them go. Not yet. The RV coasted to a shaky stop in the middle of the endless road. The engine sputtered and died, leaving the family in oppressive silence. Emily's heart raced as she turned to Ryan. "What now?" Ryan stared out the windshield, his jaw clenched. "We need answers," he said finally. His voice was resolute, though his hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. "We can't keep running. Whatever this is, it's not going to let us go until we figure it out." Emily looked down at the notebook in her lap, its pages filled with frantic scrawls and observations they had jotted down over the past hours. Her gaze settled on the first entry, turn back signs. Endless road. Shadows watching. She swallowed hard. There has to be a reason this is happening, she murmured. Emily rummaged through the RV's cupboards, her hands shaking as she searched for anything that might help. She flung open a drawer and froze. Beneath a stack of faded maps lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and worn, the edges blackened as though it had been scorched. "What's that?" Ryan asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," Emily replied, pulling it out carefully. She opened the journal, her breath catching at the first page. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "This road doesn't end. It doesn't let you leave. Beware the watchers." She flipped through the pages, each one more chilling than the last. Descriptions of encounters eerily similar to their own filled the journal. Shadows in the forest, figures on the road, the same distorted voice warning them to turn back. "The road feeds on fear," Emily read aloud, her voice trembling. "It traps you in its loop, breaking you down until you give up, or worse." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space. "So what are we supposed to do? Just wait for it to break us?" Emily flipped to the final page. The ink was smudged, but the words were still readable. "The only way out is through. Face the watchers. End the loop." As Emily closed the journal, a sudden chill swept through the RV. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, deeper. The air grew thick, pressing down on them like a physical weight. "They're here," Emily whispered, clutching the journal tightly. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, the beam slicing through the gloom. The first watcher stood just outside the RV, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Another appeared behind it, then another, until a dozen figures surrounded the vehicle, their twisted forms swaying slightly as though carried by an unseen breeze. "What do they want?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. Ryan's jaw tightened. "The journal said we have to face them. Maybe they're the key." Ryan stepped out of the RV, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Emily followed reluctantly, clutching the journal as if it were a shield. The watchers didn't move, their glowing eyes fixed on the couple. The air was icy, each breath visible in the cold. "Why are we here?" Ryan demanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "What do you want from us?" The watchers remained silent, their forms shifting slightly as if in response to his words. Then one of them raised a hand, pointing down the road. Emily stepped closer to Ryan. "What does that mean?" Ryan followed the watcher's gesture, his flashlight beam landing on something in the distance. A faint glow flickered at the edge of the horizon, like the first light of dawn. "It's a way out," he said. "It has to be." "But the journal," Emily began, but Ryan cut her off. "We don't have a choice," he said firmly. "We go toward the light." The family climbed back into the RV, their nerves frayed but their resolve strengthened. Ryan started the engine, and for the first time in hours, it roared to life without hesitation. The watchers didn't follow as they pulled back onto the road, but their presence lingered, a cold weight on their shoulders. The glow grew brighter as they drove, but the road itself seemed to fight them. The asphalt cracked and buckled beneath the tires, and the forest closed in, its branches scraping against the RV like claws. The radio crackled to life, the distorted voice returning. "You cannot leave." Emily gripped Ryan's arm. "Don't listen to it. Keep going." The headlights flickered, plunging them into darkness. For a terrifying moment, they were blind, the RV rattling violently as it barreled forward. When the lights returned, the glow was closer, but so were the shadows. As they neared the glow, the road narrowed, the forest closing in completely. The asphalt crumbled away, replaced by rough, uneven ground. The RV shuddered as it climbed a steep incline, the engine groaning under the strain. The watchers reappeared, standing in a line at the edge of the light. Their hollow eyes seemed to burn brighter, their forms more defined. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised a hand, pointing at Emily. "What do they want?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan glanced at her, his expression torn. "I don't know. Maybe they want you to finish it." Emily's heart pounded. "Me?" "The journal said, face the watchers," Ryan said. Maybe this is what it meant. Emily took a deep breath, clutching the journal tightly as she stepped out of the RV. The watchers parted, creating a narrow path that led directly into the glow. Emily hesitated, turning back to Ryan. "I'll be right here," he said, his voice steady. "You can do this." As Emily walked into the light, the air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting from her chest. The watchers followed silently, their forms growing fainter with each step. At the center of the glow was a small clearing, bathed in golden light. In the middle stood a stone pedestal, its surface etched with strange symbols. Emily placed the journal on the pedestal, the pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. The light grew brighter, enveloping her completely. For a moment, she felt weightless, her fear replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. The watchers dissolved into the light, their forms fading into nothingness. The road, the forest, the RV, all of it disappeared, leaving Emily standing in an endless expanse of golden light. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Emily blinked, the harsh light of the RV's interior snapping her back to reality. Ryan sat beside her, his hand on hers. "You did it," he said softly. The road was gone. The forest had vanished. They were parked in an open field under a clear night sky, the stars twinkling above them. "It's over," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're free." But as they drove away, a faint whisper echoed through the air, carried on the wind. The road never ends. The air was electric, pulsing with a malevolence that pressed against the walls of the RV like a living thing. Ryan and Emily sat in stunned silence, the glow on the horizon casting long, flickering shadows inside the cabin. Every instinct told them to stop, to turn back, but they knew they couldn't. The road wouldn't let them. Ryan clenched the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "This is it," he said, his voice tight. "We go toward the light." Emily nodded, her throat dry. "If we don't, we'll be stuck here forever." The RV's engine roared to life with a shudder, the headlights piercing through the encroaching darkness. The watchers remained motionless outside, their hollow eyes following every movement as the vehicle began to move. Ryan pressed down on the accelerator, and the RV lurched forward. The asphalt cracked and buckled beneath the RV's tires as though the road itself were alive, resisting their escape. The glow ahead flickered like a dying flame, always just out of reach. The forest closed in tighter, the branches scraping against the sides of the RV with a screech that made Emily flinch. "We're running out of time," Emily said, her voice trembling. The journal said to face the watchers. "What if this isn't the way out?" Ryan's eyes stayed locked on the road. "It's the only way we've got," he replied. "We can't stop now." The dashboard lights flickered, and the radio crackled to life again. The same distorted voice that had haunted them earlier spoke, louder and more commanding than before. "You cannot escape." Emily covered her ears, but the words seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the RV like an earthquake. The vehicle shuddered violently, the engine groaning as if the road itself were trying to pull them back. The watchers, once stationary, began to move. Their forms flickered and twisted, appearing and disappearing like static on a broken TV screen. One by one, they stepped onto the road, their glowing eyes fixed on the RV. Emily let out a sharp gasp as one slammed its hand against the windshield, its elongated fingers spreading like cracks across the glass. Ryan swerved, trying to shake them off, but more appeared. One clawed at the side door, its jagged nails scraping deep grooves into the metal. Another clung to the roof, its shadowy form visible through the sunroof as it pounded against the glass. "Ryan!" Emily screamed. "They're everywhere." "I see them," he shouted back, his voice strained. "Hold on." The RV veered sharply, throwing the creatures off balance. Emily grabbed the journal from the dashboard, her mind racing. She flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might help. Her eyes landed on a passage. "They fear fire. The light will drive them back." "Ryan, we need fire," Emily yelled, holding up the journal. Ryan glanced at her, sweat dripping down his face. "How are we supposed to start a fire in here?" Emily's gaze darted around the cabin. Her eyes landed on a canister of lighter fluid and a box of matches stashed in the kitchen area. She scrambled out of her seat, grabbing the supplies as the RV lurched violently. "What are you doing?" Ryan shouted, his eyes flicking between the road and the chaos inside. "Just keep driving," Emily shouted back. She soaked a rag with the lighter fluid and wrapped it around a metal rod she found in one of the cupboards. Striking a match, she lit the makeshift torch, the flames flaring to life. The effect was immediate. The watchers recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting as the firelight spread through the cabin. The one on the windshield let out a guttural screech and vanished, leaving behind a faint smudge of ash. "It's working," Emily cried. "Keep going." The glow ahead grew brighter, but the road continued to fight them. The RV's tires skidded on the cracked asphalt, and the vehicle jolted violently as the ground beneath it began to crumble. Ryan gritted his teeth, forcing the RV forward as the forest closed in completely, the branches forming a cage around them. Emily stood at the back of the cabin, waving the torch at the watchers as they closed in. Her arms ached, and the flames flickered dangerously low, but she didn't stop. "We're almost there," she shouted. The glow ahead shifted, taking on a blinding intensity. Ryan squinted against the light, his heart pounding as the RV hurtled toward it. The watchers screamed, their forms dissolving into shadows as the light consumed them. The RV burst through the barrier of light, the sudden stillness deafening after the chaos. Ryan slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt in an open field. The forest was gone. The road was gone. They were surrounded by nothing but rolling hills and a clear night sky. Emily collapsed into a chair, the torch slipping from her hand as the flames sputtered out. "We made it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're out?" Ryan sat back in his seat, his chest heaving. He turned to Emily, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "Is it over?" Emily looked out the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The glow was gone, replaced by the soft light of the stars. She nodded slowly. "I think so." The family stepped out of the RV, the cool night air washing over them. The tension in their bodies began to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. They stood in silence, taking in the serene landscape. But as they turned to head back to the RV, a faint sound reached their ears. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a low, rhythmic hum. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his eyes narrowing. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the hum of tires on asphalt. Emily turned slowly, her heart sinking. In the distance, barely visible under the starlight, was the road. It stretched endlessly into the horizon, the faint glow of headlights flickering on its surface. "No," Emily said, her voice breaking. "No, we escaped. We broke the loop." Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder, his face pale. "Maybe we didn't," he said softly. The wind carried a familiar whisper, faint but unmistakable. "The road never ends." The soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, a stark contrast to the oppressive air of the road they had left behind. Ryan and Emily stood outside the RV, gazing up at the clear night sky. Stars twinkled above them, unspoiled by the shadows that had haunted them for what felt like an eternity. "We're out," Emily murmured, more to herself than to Ryan. She wrapped her arms around her body, trying to absorb the moment. Her breath hitched as she felt a wave of relief so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. Ryan nodded, his hands on his hips as he surveyed the open field surrounding them. "Yeah," he said softly. "We made it." But even as he said the words, his voice carried a note of doubt, a thread of unease that neither of them could shake. Emily climbed back into the RV, needing the familiar surroundings to ground herself. She picked up the journal from where it had fallen during the chaos. The leather cover was scorched, its edges curled as though it had absorbed the road's malevolence. She flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling as she reread the final entry, "The road never truly ends." Ryan followed her inside, sitting heavily in the driver's seat. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily glanced up from the journal, her eyes meeting his. She wanted to tell him yes, to reassure him that they were safe. But she couldn't bring herself to lie. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't feel free." Ryan nodded, as though he had expected her answer. The hum of the RV's cooling engine was the only sound, filling the silence with an almost oppressive weight. As the night wore on, Emily noticed small, unsettling details that gnawed at her growing sense of unease. The clock on the dashboard, which had finally started moving again after they broke through the light, now ticked slower than it should. Each second dragged on, as though time itself were reluctant to move forward. The stars, while beautiful, seemed too perfect. Their patterns didn't match any constellation Emily recognized, and the more she stared, the more they seemed to pulse faintly, like distant eyes watching them. "Ryan," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's not right." He looked up from his seat, where he had been quietly staring out the windshield. "What do you mean?" "The stars, the clock," she hesitated, glancing out the window. "It doesn't feel real. Like we're still somewhere else." Ryan frowned, but before he could respond, a faint sound reached their ears. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, a low, rhythmic hum. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "We left it. We escaped." Ryan stood abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The hum grew louder, more distinct, until there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of tires on asphalt, the familiar rhythm of the endless road. The two of them stepped outside, the cool air doing little to calm their frayed nerves. In the distance, Barely visible under the faint glow of starlight, the road stretched out into the horizon, its surface shimmering faintly, as though mocking their escape. Emily took a shaky step back. "How?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How is it here?" Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but trembling. "I don't know," he said softly. "But we can't go back." The wind began to pick up, carrying with it a faint, familiar sound. Emily froze, her eyes widening as she recognized it. The whispers. They were faint but unmistakable, the same distorted voices that had haunted them on the road. "You cannot leave." Emily turned to Ryan, panic etched across her face. "It's not over," she said. "We didn't break the loop. It's still here." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Then we fight it again," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we'll fight it." But Emily wasn't sure they could. The road seemed infinite, a force beyond comprehension. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a malevolent entity that wouldn't let them go. As they stood there, staring at the road, Emily thought she saw movement. At first, it was subtle, a ripple in the shadows, a flicker at the edge of her vision. But then it became clearer. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms faint but undeniable. "The Watchers," she whispered, clutching Ryan's arm. Ryan turned to see them, his breath catching. The Watchers didn't move toward them. They simply stood at the edge of the road, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. It was as if they were waiting. "What do they want?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Ryan didn't answer. He didn't know. But the Watchers' presence was a reminder that the road's grip on them wasn't entirely broken. The hours stretched on, the Watchers remaining motionless as the couple sat inside the RV. Emily clung to the journal, flipping through its pages in search of answers. But the entries provided little comfort. They were warnings, not solutions. Ryan leaned back in his seat, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Maybe this is it," he said quietly. "Maybe we're stuck in this limbo forever." Emily shook her head, refusing to accept it. "No," she said firmly. "There has to be a way. We just haven't found it yet." Ryan sighed but didn't argue. The hope in Emily's voice, fragile as it was the only thing keeping them going. As dawn approached, the Watchers began to fade, their forms dissolving into the first rays of sunlight. The road, too, seemed to retreat, its surface shimmering faintly before disappearing altogether. Emily and Ryan stepped outside once more, the field bathed in golden light. It felt peaceful, almost normal, but the unease lingered, a shadow that wouldn't leave. "Do you think it's really gone?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the horizon, his eyes scanning for any sign of the road. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if it comes back, we'll be ready." Emily nodded, though her chest ached with doubt. As they climbed back into the RV, a faint breeze rustled the grass, carrying with it a final, chilling whisper. "The road never ends.